Okay, good morning friends and welcome to this session. As Anand has introduced, this session is on recalibrating masculinities and socio-economic change. I'll just introduce what we are going to discuss in this session, and then later I will introduce the four speakers that we have today. This session outlines how masculinity identities are recalibrated in times of socio-economic change, including the shifts in women's economic roles. The papers will describe how masculinities get redefined in relation to women workers' trade unionization, a case study of attempts to change the intra-household gender distribution of labor and resources, and traditional barriers to black men's economic mobility. In contrast is the discursive resistance of men from privileged settings who maintain their gender advantages through the neoliberal tactics of strategic ignorance. So that's the introduction of the discussion that we are going to have. I'll be happy to introduce the panel members, the speakers who are there with us from all across the globe, very eminent personalities. I would like to introduce Miss Emily Hillenbrand. Can I invite you here on stage, please? Emily works as gender and technical advisor at CARE USA, based in Atlanta. Previously, she worked as Asia Pacific Regional Gender Advisor at the Helen Keller Institute as program manager, and also as technical advisor in their Bangladesh office. Her work focuses on integrating gender transformative approaches to food and nutrition security, and she holds an MA in Women, Gender and Development from Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands. So welcome, Emily. Thank you for being with us. I would now like to invite Kadri Avik. Please come on stage here. Kadri is a PhD and a lecturer of sociology at the Institute of International and Social Studies in the Tallinn University in Estonia. Her PhD project focuses on gender and ethnic inequalities in the Estonian labor market, which she studies via individual career narratives. In her recent research, she is analyzing intersectionality, privileged masculinities, in order to understand how dominant groups are able to see themselves as normative and thereby contributing to upholding and reproducing social inequalities. Very interesting. I think it will be very interesting to listen to you. Welcome, Kadri. I would like to now invite Ms. Bhaskaran. Please join us here on the stage. Ms. Bhaskaran currently works in South Africa as a Fulbright scholar, where she researches social mobility and develops math skills development programs. Prior to this, she spent 3 years working in educational programming to empower low-income African and Hispanic youth with the skills to become first-generational college students, thus breaking the cycle of poverty. She graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, and contributions in social inequality and political communications. Welcome, Ms. Bhaskaran. I would now like to invite Neha Kagar. Neha, join us. Neha is an activist passionate about issues concerning women and violence and development. She has worked in India with sex workers and with rag pickers on the issues of rights-based advocacy, livelihoods, and domestic violence. Currently, she is pursuing a PhD in development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. So, welcome, Neha. Friends, we have about 1.5 hours for this full discussion. So we'll give about 13 to maximum 15 minutes time to each of the speakers. And then we would like to make it more of an interacting discussion. So your inputs, discussions, clarifications, lot of questions from you, which the panelists would then respond to. So can we start? And can I start with who's ready to go first? Emily?
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. And what I'd like to be talking about today is a little bit about some of the gender equality work that we do at CARE in the food and nutrition security sector, specifically in our agriculture programming. As many of you may know, there's kind of renewed attention to the role of smallholder agriculture in development for poverty alleviation, for food security, for economic growth, as well as for smallholders in climate change prevention. And what we also know is that there are deep structural gender inequalities in the agricultural sector, which hold back that economic growth as well as the productivity, potential productivity in the agricultural sector. And the majority of poor rural women are involved in some way or another in agriculture for subsistence or for the market. But underlying gender social norms and institutional structures constrain women's productivity and their socialized roles, men's characterization as breadwinners, privilege them in terms of access to resources and in institutions and support, whereas women are constrained by multiple labor constraints. They're expected to prioritize the domestic duties. They have less access to the inputs and support that they need for productive engagement in agriculture. So our understanding is that unless we target these underlying gender inequalities, including the social norms and institutions, we'll not see those increases in productivity or improvements in food security and income generation. So what I'd like to talk about today is a model that we've been developing within CARE based on our years of experience in programming around agriculture and some of the research that we've done. And the model is called Pathways, and it's a program that's striving for more equitable agricultural systems. And it's based around this theory of change that sees increased productivity and empowerment as interlinked objectives. We know that we cannot achieve gains in productivity and food security unless we address those underlying inequalities, but also those increases in productivity and revenue feed into women's empowerment at a household and community level. So we work on these 5 levers of change: increasing capacity of women, access of women to resources, increased productivity. But critically, these 4 change levers 4 and 5 are looking at the influence of women at the household level, and 5, the enabling environment, which includes gender equality in the market structures and the extension services, as well as those community norms and beliefs around men and women. Just briefly about CARE, we really place gender equality at the heart of our work, and we've been working for many years on women's and girls' empowerment, but we also are increasingly focusing on engaging men simultaneously, not only for women's empowerment, but also recognizing that they have their own unique inequalities and poverty challenges. So Pathways is in 6 countries. It's a 6-country program funded by the Gates Foundation. We're in 4 countries in Africa and 2 in South Asia. And ways that we engage men in this program, we target 50,000 smallholder women. But the ways that we engage men are, we target 2 groups principally, the community leaders and the institutional leaders who can support access to resources with day laborers in the wage sector, day labor sector, and also principally for land access. And we also work with spouses and male partners around the gender norms and engagement in the programming. We work on, this is our model for how we're working with men and boys across CARE. And a key intervention is also the conscientization process, which starts with internalization and reflection from the staff down to the extension agents and the community volunteers that we work with. So the gender dialogues that we have at community level are one key intervention. Staff training throughout the program is another. A key focus in Pathways is on relationship building between men and women, again with those between couples at the household level, but also at the community level with those service providers, and building negotiation skills between women and the market actors. And we also work in all of our countries with identifying male role models who are willing to practice and try out new, more gender equitable practices. And we organize some kind of public events, cooking demonstrations, where we engage these male champions to demonstrate publicly these kind of practices. And this is just some snapshots of the type of gender dialogue type work that we would do. And we think that, all of the dialogues that we do are very participatory, and they're oriented toward participants recognizing their own challenges and privileges and disparities. They're designed to spark dialogue and introspection, not messaging. And here's some pictures of men and women engaged in cooking demonstrations, in dialogues around power and inequality, and some trust-building exercises that we've done. And the topics that we generally cover in this program are workload sharing. We talk about communication skills and listening skills between men and women, decision making. We do some power discussions, and we have some dialogues around the discriminations that the women face in the agriculture sector. This is another tool that we use for the conscientization process, working with our staff. We believe that change starts from within. So these topics are aligned with the topics that we're talking about in the community, but we recognize that the staff cannot encourage other people to change if they're not also practicing what they're preaching. So this is a tool that we can tell you more about later for staff to also start adopting more gender equitable practices in their own households. Pathways is a 5-year program. We're about midway through, and what I'd like to talk about today is the evaluation that we've just recently conducted over the past few months. At midterm, it was a strictly qualitative evaluation because we had a lot of questions from our staff about how do we know what we're doing. We're seeing some changes, but how do we know what's really happening at the household level? And particularly around, we know that we're seeing increases in productivity and income and so on, but to measure these sort of fuzzier topics, we wanted to engage our staff in the process of evaluating where we are and moving towards equity and empowerment. And on the men engaged side, that was a big focus of this study, was looking at how have they been involved, what behaviors are we seeing changing, and what factors are kind of contributing to those changes, they're positive or negative. So we used outcome mapping as the methodology, which focuses on behavior changes in actions and relationships. And we carried this out in 5 of our 6 countries over 3 months. And just to give you a sense of where we've seen some changes observed, a major change area was around the division of labor, because it's been one of the key topics that staff have started out talking with in the Pathways program is workload sharing. We've seen a lot of changes in this area, and we tallied the frequency with which these behavior changes were observed by the participants, by the respondents, and that gave us an idea of where there's been greater change. So collecting firewood, collecting water, particularly if there's a cart or bicycle, that has been the most common behavior change around workload sharing. Men are farming together with their wives. They're sharing some of the traditional, easier to adopt practices like heavy labor, but in women's fields. In India, there's some weeding in which men are participating because there's a mechanical weeder that's been introduced. So with that tool, they're willing to support that process, which is typically a woman's job. The less common changes are those that involve childcare and more of the indoor reproductive type of tasks. Some of the specifically women-only tasks like mudding the floor in Malawi or sweeping. We've seen some few change agents taking up these practices, but it's less frequent. Men are more likely to support with household chores when the wife is sick or when she's busy or when she's attending a meeting, but not as a normal practice. One of the biggest changes that we've observed was around communication. This again was a topic that we covered in many of the dialogue sessions, and we see it as sort of a gateway toward the more equal decision-making processes. But there were a lot of observations about men and women's dialogue style changing. In Mali, we heard a lot about men and women are sitting down together. It's no longer taboo for them to sit face to face. Women are able to speak more directly to boys. And a big and positive outcome in Malawi was about how this communication has translated into intimacy in the bedroom, which is a very important outcome for both men and women. The men were also valuing these qualitative changes in the relationship. Decision-making was also a topic that we covered in our dialogues, and we've seen smaller changes in this area, but again, the incremental early changes, it's clear that men are still making the final decisions, but there's more consultation of women. Women are being brought into the process. There are some changes around those agricultural decisions. Women are making the decisions around their own plots particularly, but they're also engaged in some discussions around the entire household production decisions. Women are making some expenditure decisions independently as well. One of the findings that women noted was that they were using a participatory tool to talk about decision making, and they listed the production decisions and the household decisions, and they noted where men and women were involved. And they observed, our opinion is only asked for when our money is needed. And so that was kind of an awareness for them that they were dissatisfied with that situation and wanted to work on that. We've been engaging with community leaders, and we've seen that where we've been engaging with them, they're also playing a really important role in making sure that women are brought into the community decision-making processes. And there's a big shift in men's perceptions of women's groups. They're seeing the benefits, the economic benefits, and they're more accepting of women's groups and encouraging them to participate in them. So that's just a few highlights from the major changes that we've observed around men's engagement. And the factors that we've seen that support some of these changes are, again, women's group membership, the fact that they are participating in groups, and that there are economic benefits, tangible benefits to the household from women's participation in these groups. Increased productivity, as well as the group savings they get from joining groups. A lot of men were encouraging their wives to join the groups, but also interested in joining themselves. We heard a lot of references to some specific dialogues. So we've seen significant changes within a short time of initiating these dialogues. And where countries have started doing them well, we saw people referring to those topics. So they stuck in people's minds, and people would refer back to the titles of the dialogues, the persons and things. And so they'd say, I'm no longer treated like a thing, I'm treated like a person, which is one of the topics that we covered. The importance of role models can't be underestimated. We saw that some of the more progressive changes are being adopted by fewer men, but they look to each other, and they those change agents are talking to other men, and in some cases it's a matter of seeing for yourself. There was one man in Mali who said that he came home from a dialogue and he started talking to other men about, he saw a man, it's possible for men to do women's household tasks, and they didn't believe him, so he took a group of men to another village so that they could see for themselves that there is a man who every day sweeps the household. And so that type of seeing for yourself and knowing that other people do it is an important factor. Yeah, this is not. And there was a perception overall that gender-based violence had decreased, and this was There was a discrepancy between men's and women's views on this, but we did see that where there were penalties in place, institutions enforcing gender-based violence fines, that contributed to decrease in gender-based violence. But we also came across a number of obstacles to men's engagement that we need to be aware of and focusing on for the rest of our program duration. There was a lot of backlash against those male change agents who take on new roles. In Tanzania, this is called bushoke, derogatory term for men who are acting unmanly. So that is a deterrent to some of those men who try out new practices. And we also saw some other negative changes that we want to watch out for, which is that in some cases, particularly where women have become economically empowered, we find that men are retracting from their own household contributions and throwing up their hands and saying, okay, you take it on if you want to be empowered. And there was a very negative perception around women who are becoming too empowered, and there's a fear that they will want to reverse power structures and power inequalities completely. So these are some of the risks that we want to be looking out for. But these findings have been discussed among our country teams, and being engaged in that process has given us a better understanding of the progression of behavior changes and where we can push from that entry point to more transformative practices in our houses and communities. Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily, for that interesting sharing about the Pathways program of care and how we are working with smallholder women farmers as well as with their families in changing the attitudes, behaviors, right from there to the economic empowerment of women. Thank you. I think there will be a lot of questions, interesting because it was very interesting. So can I now invite Neha to for her presentation?
Very good afternoon to everyone. What I'll be presenting today is a working paper based on my PhD thesis. I've just completed fieldwork, so my paper is really a working paper, and I really look forward to your comments and criticisms and whatever you can add. My paper is titled Not Just a Worker, the Impact of Collectivization of Informal Economy Workers on Inter-Household Gender Relations, and it's really inspired by my work with rag pickers or waste pickers in the city of Pune. For those of you all who are not familiar with rag pickers, they're women. I mean, in Pune, they're typically women. They're the poorest of the poor. They belong to the lowest caste, the various Dalit subcaste. And they basically pick recyclable material from garbage bins across the city and sell it forward for recycling, and that's how they earn their livelihood. So they're daily wage earners, and if they don't work, they don't earn that day. So in the early 90s, there was a trade union of waste pickers which was established, and they've done phenomenal work over the last 20 odd years. And I really had the privilege of working for them for a brief period. And why I'm focusing on the informal economy workers in my thesis is because India has a really large number. 93% of our economy is informal, and 9 out of every 10 women work in this informal economy. And I mean, as we all know, conditions of work are extremely precarious, etc., etc. When I was working at the union, we had a union member who was 23 years old, and one of our most vocal, active members. So she'd be there at all our demonstrations. She'd come for every meeting. She was really, like, if you had to put a tick mark against the empowered waste picker, she would fit it. She knew there was insurance available to her. She had the support of community members. She was what we call a Vasti Pratinidhi, so she was a representative of the waste pickers in her slum. And one day she had a fight with her husband, and she poured kerosene on herself, burnt herself, and died. And she has 2 very young children. And it really made me wonder why did the union actually have an impact on gender relations in the home? Were things inside the home changing? There was a lot changing outside. There was a lot changing in the public sphere. Conditions of work were improving. There was recognition by various state authorities. There was recognition. There was dignity. But were things changing in the home? And if they were, what things were changing? And if they weren't, why were we as union members not able to reach out to such women? So this is what really inspired my research. My primary research question is, how might working women's affiliation to a labor organization impact gender relations in the home? And the link with masculinities, because, coming to that, is that I've looked at gender relations as both women and men, of course, and how do men actually respond to these changes. Under what circumstances are men likely to respond positively to these changes in women, and what might help to explain their resistance? The context of my research is a trade union in Pune called the Kagat Patra Kashtakari Panchayat. They have 6,500 members, most of whom, about 95% of them are women. Most of these women are illiterate, and they are, of course, extremely poor. The methodology, I used a qualitative research methodology. The demographic details, like I said, all the women and men belong to Dalit subcaste, the Mahar, the Mathangs, and the Niyog Buddhists, one of the Dalit subcastes, but identify as different. They were all mostly illiterate. The women were between the age group of 25 to 40. Their husbands between 36 to 50, because usually they marry men older than them. And why I chose 25 was because I wanted to make sure that women had been working in the union for at least 5 years, and the union doesn't take in anyone less than 18, so 25 was the starting point. And why I stopped at around 40, because there is a lot of research, and of course a lot of what I saw was that older women, there was a reduction in domestic violence within the home, and it was primarily attributed to age and children growing older. So 25 to 40 is what is my sample age. And the waste pickers should have been married or in marriage-like arrangements when I was interviewing them. I conducted 70 in-depth interviews with 3 categories of workers. So the unionized waste pickers, their husbands, and I also used a control group of non-unionized waste pickers. So people who were picking garbage but were in Pune but were not part of the union. And I used focus group discussions and interpretive focus groups. The theoretical framework I think I will be using for my research is the bargaining framework. The bargaining model was, I think, really popular in the 70s with economists, and at that point the conceptualization of the household was this unitary household where incomes are pooled and you have this altruistic household head who will decide who gets resources based on altruism. And then, of course, this was critiqued, and then there were people who said, academics and activists who said that resources need not necessarily be distributed by altruism. There's some amount of conflict. When do people cooperate? When don't they? But the common thing to all these bargaining models was that bargaining power was defined in terms of fallback positions. So individuals who had a better fallback position consequently did better in bargaining within the home. But the criteria of what constituted these fallback positions was narrow and initially focused only on income. Then there are a lot of feminist economists who introduced qualitative aspects like socio-cultural norms, legitimacy of claims, exit options, internal-external evaluation of the work you do, which affects your bargaining within the home. However, there's still a dearth of literature on how resources like collectivization, unionization, solidarity, dignity of labor, improved conditions of work, whether these have an impact on bargaining power within the home. And of course, there's nothing written on, at least not that I'm aware of, on how do you actually include men within this bargaining framework. My findings are in 4 areas. existing inter-household gender relations, because primarily for Dalit men and women in Maharashtra, I didn't find much in, I have much literature about men and women's relationships. So I needed to start with how do these relationships actually look, why do they actually look that way, and how have they changed, the impact of organizing of these women, the changes in inter-household gender relations, and men masculinity, and how men fit into this change. So I'm going to go through the first three aspects really quickly, because just to give you a background to understand my last part about men and masculinity. If you conceptualize marriage and the family within India, you can use what Denise Kandioti called classic patriarchy, which basically means that girls are usually married at a young age into families which are headed typically by the husband's father. They're subordinate to men, elders, honor resides in the bodies of women. Women's position is tied to the ability to produce male offspring, and there's a high patriarchal risk, which means that without male protection and guardianship, a woman typically loses economic security and social status. Understandably, men's fallback positions are strengthened by these socio-cultural norms under classic patriarchy. And under classic patriarchy, what it means for men is that they're normatively obliged to provide for these women. They're not really expected to help with inter-household chores. And masculinity is associated with forms of control over women, violence, control over their sexuality, and things like that. The differences I did see in Mahar and Matam women and men was that mobility, I mean, there's been a lot written about, lot that I've read about Dalit women in the South, and typically they are they're supposed to have better mobility or higher mobility because they work. In my sample, I found that mobility was conditional, so women were allowed to go out and work only if men could not work anymore. There was also a high amount of occupational violence, so when women did go out to work, there was a lot of suspicion cast by their husbands would follow them, so there was violence there as well. Domestic violence was very high, almost 70% of women reported domestic violence, and despite the men having this normative obligation of having to provide for the family, many of them didn't take responsibility, failed to take accountability for this. And amongst these women, taking on multiple partners is common in the sense that there was a difference between a good woman and a bad woman. And if your husband didn't provide for you, you could take on another man who would economically provide for you, and no one said it, and it's acceptable. But if you are doing it purely for lust, if your husband is providing for you, he gives you money every month, he doesn't beat you up too much, and then you take on a lover, that's a problem. But otherwise, it wasn't. I do personally, I look at this as significantly empowering and very different from other groups. I mean, women in India. Membership to the union, I'm using Naila Kabir's differentiation of material, cognitive, and relational resources which accrue to women when they were part of this union. And by material, I mean access to work, higher wages, having things like children's education being taken care of, opening savings bank accounts, having options of credit, things like that. Cognitive resources were recognition, respect, information, knowledge, courage, confidence, understanding the value of your work, changes in a sense of self, the recognition that you're no longer just someone's wife or someone's mother, but you're someone's sister, you're a friend, you're a comrade. That really made a difference. And of course, relational resources, which were just, really blew me away when women spoke about the support, the solidarity, friendship, the trust, the inclusion, the sense of having your own space. A lot of them refer to the union as their Mahed Ghar, which is their maternal home, a place that they could go to at any point in time. The fact that the union's presence was constant, it wasn't conditional, it wasn't like going back to your natal family in that sense was conditional. You couldn't go back for in an indefinite period. If you had children, it was more complicated. So the union was a place they could really find a constant sense of support. And of course, there was a reciprocity in friendship. So friends, they mentioned having friends who really cared about them and who were not, as opposed to in the vastis or in the slums, having friends who were I guess, who weren't, how do I put it, I wouldn't say didn't care about them, but whose ultimate aim was not the benefit of this woman. So, there was a difference in the quality of the friendship. And what I'm looking at is how these resources have actually impacted women's private life. My gosh, okay. The changes in intra-household gender relations actually were, what I found, were only for women who are active in the union, not women who were inactive in the union. And so obviously it signified that just membership to a union was not enough. The time you were a member of a union, a length of membership was not enough. It was really how much you were invested in the union. The changes were largely a reduced tolerance to violence, in a greater ability to assert yourself, challenge your husband's alcoholism, unemployment, question his role as this nominal head of the family, abdicate role of as wife. So there were many women who just stopped cooking for their husbands, stopped cleaning their clothes, stopped talking to their in-laws, things like that. Telling their husband, I don't need you anymore, you can leave, completely ignoring them. And husbands were really upset by this. So when I did interview men, there were several of them who just broke down and cried, because it's really sad. There is no space we create within our community for men to talk about this sense of emasculation they feel. So for example, a woman said, I feel strong. I feel that I'm bhari, which means amazing. If I look after 4 children, then I must be really strong. I don't need my husband anymore. Whether he stays or he doesn't, it doesn't make a difference to me now. I don't need you anymore, I tell my husband. If it's in my naseeb, maybe I'll meet another man who can live off me. So, men, masculinity, and change within the home. So, just a quote from a woman. From a man. This is what one of the husbands says. Now she goes everywhere. She talks well. She has become stronger after joining the union. How are our Sanghatna women? Sanghatna means union. They are not scared of anyone because they have the Sanghatna. They aren't even afraid of their husbands. Now she is like that. Earlier she was a little afraid of me. She didn't say much to me. But now she just lets off. Last year she complained to the police because I hit her. I just slapped her once. It wasn't even too much. But she immediately went to the police station. I had to pay the cops rupees 3,000 to get out. So now she has power because of the union. Husband-wife fights happen in every home. So what is the need to complain to the police? So, there was a change in husbands of active women, and not all the changes were necessarily behavioral changes in terms of taking more care of the kids or cooking. There were changes in the way they actually viewed their wives, and I think that is very important. So earlier, where like I mentioned, the abuse, following your wives to work, objecting to them being part of meetings, etc., etc. The changes that did take place were husbands began taking care of children and cooking when women went for meetings, and not all, some, and I still have to analyze this much further. The levels of domestic violence definitely reduced. They began vocalizing the fact that their wives were smart, and that really made a difference to women, because this was the first time their husbands were actually articulating a sense of pride, a sense of saying something positive. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Just 2 minutes. Okay, they began having sex with consent and apologizing after episodes of violence. And most importantly, why? If you're looking at what is it in it for men to change, like really, why do they need to change? I did find that their role as the head of the family was directly challenged, and it upset them, it forced them to change. There were benefits to the union accrued to them in the public sphere, so being able to get a ration card because of the union, or being able to, for example, getting a ration card, being proud of your wife's involvement in the union. Your wife goes for more, she goes to Delhi for a demonstration, she goes to Bombay, she goes to the US. And last 30 seconds, the bargaining, if you look at the bargaining framework, bargaining power was voluntarily let go of men in exchange, let go of by men in exchange for this pride, being a good father, in the sense that if the mother's earnings allow the children to go to school, it kind of reduced the pressure on him to be a good father, as well as negotiated, because now women had things that gave men a greater fallback position were now challenged. So women were no longer docile, no longer compliant. They began valuing their labor and began to question their husbands. Yes. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry I went over time.
Thank you, Neha.
session. That was very interesting about your research work on the waste picker and rat picker women in Pune. Thank you. Can I now invite Sadhvi for your sharing?
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm going to take you now to a very different context. So I'm going to be talking about the context of Estonia, a very small country in northeastern Europe, and I'm studying privileged masculinities in my PhD research, and in this very brief time I'm going to attempt to give you an overview of some of it. So basically I'm presenting something that I wrote, had a good opportunity to write for a book that you see there, which is forthcoming, edited by Michael Flood and Richard Housen. And this book actually deals with practices, good practices from different local contexts on how to engage men in gender equality initiatives. And when I started thinking about the context of Estonia, to kind of define what are these practices and initiatives by men, then it turned out that there are no good examples, and I was really disappointed in that. And then I decided to actually write about the resistance that the groups of men display towards gender equality, the idea of it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And just a bit of background. So as I said, it cannot really be taken for granted that in all local settings and cultural contexts, gender equality initiatives by men emerge, and we really need to look at contexts to think why this could be so. And so in Estonia, gender equality is in fact promoted by feminist groups, but it really still encounters a lot of resistance in the Estonian society. And actually a very recent statistical indicator by the World Economic Forum Gender Equality Index, Estonia is in the 62nd place, and it actually has fallen, and it is in a place that in Estonia many people, including the political leaders, want to sort of view us and imagine us as part of the Nordic space. Finland, Sweden, Norway, where their gender equality initiatives are really prominent, and they are much higher in that index. So definitely we do not belong there, and we do have very large gender and ethnic disparities in the Estonian labor market. So we actually have the highest gender pay gap in the European Union, which is 30%. And so the economic and political elite is largely composed of Estonian men. And these men, and just a bit of context, some more. While we have this very large Russian minority, they are ethnicized, not racialized. So they are also considered white. And but the ethnic sort of borders are really in place, and they are difficult to be challenged. And so in my research, I explore the lack of efforts by men to initiate and be incorporated in gender equality initiatives, and I focus on a particular group. So I call them, I name them intersectionally privileged. So that means that in these categories, in terms of the categories of gender, ethnicity, class, and others, they are positioned in privileged locations in most contexts. But actually the privilege for them works really well in the particular Estonian context. So if they move out of Estonia, let's say they go to Western Europe, so there they, in a way, they become marked. So they are being ethnicized, they have their accents, they have to relate to different norms of masculinity, and there they are no longer unmarked, you see? So the privilege sort of, in a way, disappears. So I think that's really important. And so I used qualitative methods, and I interviewed 15 ethnic Estonian male managers who work in the public and private sector. And so I take into account all this East European and post-socialist context. So Estonia used to be part of the Soviet Union until 1991, and that really still has an impact on people's lives nowadays. So about men and masculinities in Estonia very shortly. So researchers have found that participation in paid work is very central to men's lives, and it's a really crucial arena of doing masculinity in the public sphere, and it's an important source of self-validation to many men. And interestingly, if you know about the concept of hegemonic masculinity, which most of you do, of course, so in the context of Estonia, researchers have described it as a very interesting sort of hybrid. So it combines elements of transnational business masculinity, and then also sort of as an hegemonic principle, nationalism is really important. As I said, there's a big Russian-speaking population, and that actually means that ethnic majority men are much better able to position themselves in relation to this ideal. So basically, I'm going to skip the part of the theories I used, but so I focused on how these men frame gender and gender equality in the context of work. And I will just outline 3 ways how they do that, how they present that in the context of work. And basically, just briefly about the method, so I asked them to use narrative methods, and I asked them to narrate their careers, their career tracks. And also there was then a lot of discussion about gender and gender equality, both explicitly and implicitly in the narratives. So what happened was that in the first kind of framing, they essentialized gender and gender differences. So they differentiated men's work from women's work, and they constructed this distinction based on perceived biological differences. So many of these men were working in technical sectors, and they just justified the lack of women in these sectors with very complex and technical nature of the work, which was then seen as unsuitable to women. And it was also constructed as this is, for the women's sake, that they don't really also want to work in these sectors. So I have some quotes here also to illustrate these points. So one of these managers said, "Women are great and they cope well. We should have more of them, but only in some jobs. They should be dealing with softer things. A woman is a mother after all." So basically, even if actually they noticed women's absence from their fields of work, and they expressed the need for more women to enter into particular male-dominated sectors of work for top management, then this need was justified with different ways of managing that women will bring with them. And so this stemmed from what they saw as essential differences between men and women, and they referred to innate characteristics such as empathy, gentleness and caring that women, according to them, possess. So another quote, one of the managers was talking about a colleague, a female manager in his organization, and was saying the way she is able to deal with them, her subordinates, is impressive. At the same time, she is so nicely balancing and mother-like in this group of men. So they used paternalistic discourses to essentialize women as different due to biological factors, and also depicted women as potentially vulnerable and then unsuitable for some jobs. And they kept then, in doing this, the implicit male norm as a point of reference, and they left this unquestioned. The second discursive strategy that they used, which was really prominent in the narratives, they emphasized differences on the individual level, and this was used as a way of avoiding addressing structural inequalities in the labor market, which are very much present in the Estonian labor market, as I mentioned. So something that is discussed a lot in the Estonian media is the gender pay gap, obviously, as it is 30%. And this indicator, in fact, was not entirely accepted by these men, and they displayed sort of disbelief, and they even presented it as a debatable issue. So one of them is saying, well, first of all, I don't even know if this gender pay gap has been factually proven. Are men getting more or not? I don't know that. So basically, the reasons for the gender pay gap were seen as, gender segregation in the labor market, men and women working in different sectors and different positions in the same organization. But then the discussion was very much brought to an individual level. So one of them was saying, this is an incredibly large difference. Well, I don't know. I think it depends on the position where you work. But our female accountant is earning much more than I. I don't know, but I think. So this was really sort of typical in the narratives. And so the gender differences in pay were reduced to personal differences and the ambitions of individuals, genderless individuals, who are selling their human capital in the labor market. And so basically, if these individuals do not know their proper value, then that's not the problem of the employer. And so individual differences were also used to justify discriminatory organizational practices. Things like, I'm quoting, each person asks what he or she is happy with, and then paying one employee less for the same work cannot be unethical, because every person is selling himself or herself and their time. And then also misunderstanding and rejecting measures to attempt to correct inequalities at work were very much present, and then quotas were really opposed as an unfair mechanism. I'm not sure if I have time to read all these quotes. Some of them are quite long. But basically, the idea of this is that applying the gender quota would mean the harassment of the other party, and things should sort of be left to work themselves out, and we shouldn't really intervene according to them. And so this misunderstanding the aims and the functioning of quotas, it constitutes another way of avoiding confrontation with structural inequalities. And then reasons for lack of women in boardrooms are seen in women themselves. And this is really consistent with a neoliberal ideology present in Estonia and in the entire region of Eastern Europe. And also it could be a legacy of the Soviet system that we had, where jobs were not really, you did not apply for them, but they were assigned. And then importantly, if structural inequalities are not seen as disadvantaging certain groups, then they are not also seen as advantaging other groups. In that case, these Estonian male managers. And the final strategy that I want to highlight that they used, then gender equality was declared as unimportant, and they distanced themselves from this issue. And this was possible due to this intersectionally privileged position that they were occupying and which was taken for granted. Another long quote, I'm not sure if I'll be able to read it, but yeah, basically he was saying that gender equality is not something that we should seriously consider, and that shouldn't be artificially shaped, as this interviewee is saying. And basically then others were constructed as marked and deviating from the norm, for instance Russian women in the Estonian labor market. So this one I think is important, so I read it out. Russian women, for example, are very dutiful and fast workers, but some people will never become independent engineers. They need someone to be there to tell them how to do things. Well, people are different, but mostly those people who never become independent are women, however. So in that case, the Russian-speaking women were seen as deviating from this implicit Estonian male norm, and they were constructed as less capable, essentialized, and they were, this time these men relied on perceived group differences. And so they discursively distanced themselves and their organizations from concern with gender equality. And this is actually despite the fact that all this legal framework is very much present, and employers are actually by law required to not even to stop unequal treatment, but even to promote equal treatment in organizations. But this is not really known by the employers very well, or the population. So basically, these were the three ways of framing gender and gender equality. So gender differences were essentialized, structural inequalities dismissed, and also there was distancing of oneself and one's organization from concern with gender equality. And the way how I see it, I think this can be understood as a way of practicing and perpetuating strategic ignorance. If some of you are familiar, this is this is used in whiteness studies, and this can be performed by unmarked privileged groups who are not marked by different categories. So this means that this ignorance is simply not a gap in knowledge, but it is performed strategically with the aim to support privilege. I'll try to be quick. So definitely this cultivation of strategic ignorance is supported by institutional systems, as I mentioned, the neoliberal ideology in Estonia. And Raven Connell, I use her work a lot. So according to her, neoliberalism is much more than just a market ideology, but an agenda for social restructuring where equality is not actually supposed to be inequality, not as a side effect, but central element. And it seems to me that we have on the one side feminist efforts to build gender equality, and then we have neoliberalism, and it seems like they are really incompatible, because one neoliberalist ideology emphasizes individual achievement, whereas feminists and pro-feminist movements emphasize structural conditions. Okay, and just finally, I think what could be the solutions. So definitely, how to get men involved in gender equality initiatives. Privileged groups must see themselves also as gendered and ethnicized, and critically examine their roles. And initiatives must come from men themselves. So positive role models are necessary, especially among privileged groups. And I think what is needed is sort of a collective recognition of complicity in benefiting from social structures and institutions that produce and uphold invisible intersectional privilege for some groups. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadri. So another interesting input from a different segment altogether. This research with men and women working in the public and private sector. So I will now invite Grace Bhaskaran for her presentation.
Good morning. So I guess you're going around the globe today, because now we're going to Africa. So I am doing research in South Africa, and so first I would like to give you a bit of a background image. So South Africa has long been considered the economic anchor of the African continent. When we think big infrastructure, we often think of places like Cape Town and Johannesburg. However, recently, as of this year, the economy has fallen into second place behind Nigeria. And economist Michael Monaghan described the South African economy as stagnant. And it really kind of leaves you to wonder, because South Africa's been on the forefront for a while. And I guess what I would kind of push you to think about as we start is, considering the racial demographics of South Africa, it's impossible to thrive and continue growing and to improve the socio-economic outcomes for the country without including really upwardly lifting the black population of South Africa. So let's kind of put some numbers to this. During the 2010 mid-year census, the government provided 5 racial categories, one of which was so small that they said, hey, we can just omit this. But the other 4 were blacks, coming in right around 80%, whites at 9%, colored at 8.8%, and just a little bit of context between colored, that typically just means you're multiracial in South Africa, and Indian and Asian at 2.6%. But if you put your eyes to the bottom of that screen, you'll notice that only 4.2 million of the 42.4 million blacks in the country are in the middle class, and that's only 10%. So we've got a really, really big problem at hand, which will contribute to a stagnant economy if only 10% are in the middle class and about 1% are in the upper class. So what is the middle class? Everyone has kind of got a different definition as to what they would call it. I like the University of Cape Town's definition, so I ran with it. And it classifies South Africa's middle class as households earning between 15,000 rands, so about $1,500, and 50,000 rands per month, with their own transport, an education after high school, employment in a white-collar job, and owning their home, or spending more than 4,000 rands a month on rent. So you have a couple different qualifications, which does limit, the people we can include there. So here is what I've been coming to realize out in the field, is that despite a rapidly modernizing economy, we remain stagnant. Through interviews with a variety of key stakeholders, we have identified 2 primary contributing factors that are also very racially divisive. A is a growing sense of entitlement, which when I interview white people is what they'll usually blame. And B, traditional work structures. And the people that I've interviewed come from all facets of life. So we've done, I live in a mining town, which you'll learn about in a bit, so mine management versus blue-collar mine workers. The king, so I live with the Royal Bafokeng people, which are one of Africa's biggest tribes. And we have a king, and then we have 12 little kings. So we've interviewed, like, part of the royal family, as well as some of the smaller, like the regional kings, per se. We've also interviewed educators. We've interviewed blue-collar workers from just different areas that we've run into. So the restaurants, the gym. So we've gotten a really cool demographic, and I sometimes think I get a really interesting perspective being the only American in this town. For the first 2 months that I was interviewing, they called me CNN. I didn't have a name. And finally one day I said, why? And they said, well, you're the only time we've ever heard this voice in real life off the TV. So that was, you know, a really interesting experience, but I did get a very cool insight. So I'm focusing on traditional work structures, but I think to understand the situation at hand, you need to understand the underlying political force. So I'm going to give you two examples. Julius Malema was a 2014 presidential candidate from the newly formed Economic Freedom Fighter Party, and he aligns closely with Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. And Malema promised to expropriate land from whites without compensation. And according to Malema, this would ease the government's burden of providing millions of black South Africans with housing. And the second one I would give, which in a second I will get a little bit closer into where I live, is our king. So we call him Kosi, which means king in Setswana. And he said, I'll provide land free of cost as well as water to Bafokeng people living in the nation's capital of, the Bafokeng nation's capital of Bafokeng. And so they automatically get a free plot of land, which is nice, but it does carry implications. Now let's revert back to the second one, which is traditional work structures. The rigidity of traditional work structures is devalue education and promote fields that rely heavily on male-dominated manual labor, such as mining and localized agriculture, which, as we learned, like agriculture tends to be a male-heavy field, have significantly hindered economic growth, because these types of work rarely generate economic mobility. Primarily, it is men who work in agriculture and mines, and in the traditional value system, women still tend to stay at home with the children. As such, men play an instrumental role in improving economic outcomes. So there's a couple other implications with men here, is that educated men tend to encourage their children to do better, they tend to treat their family better, and even public health outcomes. There's all sorts of other factors here, lower HIV rates. So men tend to be a staple here in driving the economy. All right, so let's get a closer look at where I live. Rustenburg is a rural town located about 120 kilometers from Pretoria. The economy is mining-based, and over 80% of the world's platinum comes from this region. Rustenburg made world headlines over the last 2 years due to the Marikana mining strikes, because they were killed as they were striking for higher wages. The blue-collar mining workers were finding it difficult to sustain themselves on about the $700 a month that they were making. And we also saw a really high increase in crime, to the point that 90% of our police department was fired a couple months ago because of corruption. And a lot of it became crime out of necessity, because many of them hadn't received a paycheck in about a month. So throughout South Africa, but especially in rural areas, a pervasive mentality is doing it the way it's always been done. In Rustenburg, it's very common to see third-generation mine workers who, using their limited wages, support a woman and her children. And the reliance on these traditions that emphasize compliance and the status quo are something we've termed as the compliance syndrome model. Additionally, another thing we found in our work is that people who veer away from compliance syndrome and say, I'm going to do my own thing, which is a very big idea in the West, tend to get ostracized a bit by, tribal norms. So my background is in education, and so when I came in, I said, well, there's got to be more to this problem. You can't take a group of mid-40-year-olds and say, we're going to change the face of poverty in this country. So I started looking at kids, and so what we did is we surveyed about 250 kids from the Bafokeng tribe that we work with. And we noticed, and so we asked a very simple question that kids are often asked a lot: what do you want to be when you grow up, and why? And it was really the why that threw them for the loop, because they had great answers for the what, but it was why. And so we had one of two things. Students were naive about thoughts on a career path. One student wrote, "I want to be an engineer." Why, you ask? Because the guy down the street driving the Beamer is an engineer. So there's this false thought process of like what a career entails. 2, students had no idea what career path to pursue and defaulted to whatever their parents were doing, which in our area is more likely than not mining. The latter was more prevalent. So we said we've got to come up with an action plan, because I work with an institute that takes research and we try to make a plan to fix it, because research alone, we've got to turn it into action. So poverty mitigation, improving upward social outcomes must begin early. This is why a lot of politicians in recent times have said let's start with early childhood education, because education alters life trajectories, it alters potential for upward social mobility, and it breeds opportunities. And social mobility, in summary, is basically your ability to move up and down different socioeconomic brackets, and ideally we want you to move up. So here's kind of what we figured out. We figured out that we need, based on our interviews and based on the surveys we got from our kids, we realized we need cognitive growth. Through a careful analysis, we looked at what their life skills are, our matric pass rate, so how many kids are passing their exams that would get them into college, career assessments, and the number of students applying to universities. We noticed a significant weakness in the area of cognitive growth. Let's go back to that kid that says, hey, I want to be an engineer because of the guy who drives a Beamer. Their math scores are low, and they have no experience in the field of mine engineering or any type of engineering, so they don't really know what they're looking at. So we decided we need to teach students to connect the dots of knowledge and break past this rigid work structure that's kind of at stake. It'll help them aim higher. So we launched a project called Dream on Africa, and it's an organization that hopes to revive the spirit of learning through innovation and critical social thinking. And we really think that we have the resources and we just need to tap into them. So here's the basis of Dream on Africa. We decided we don't want to encourage our kids to sit and wait for opportunity to come to them, because the opportunity might not come in their life cycle. So we decided we need to get these kids to go out and find the opportunity, and we kind of did that based on the idea of innovation and creativity, that we want them to be producers of opportunity and not just consumers, which we have a very consumeristic mentality. Great, these are all big ideas, but what does this actually look like in practice? So we have 4 big goals that we've put into action here, and we wanted to see what will this do. Number 1, long-term career mentors. It is great to have a one-time guest lecture from a doctor, but that's not sustainable, because eventually that comes and goes in passing. 2, hands-on fieldwork to supplement textbook learning. 3, develop partnerships with schools to facilitate field trips to universities. And 4, continually evaluate progress of learners. So, long-term career mentors. Up here, we took the kids, we've developed a strategic partnership with a company called Loneman. It's a mine, because as I get to later, we have very limited opportunities in Rustenburg. But we took 3 people. Omoholo's on the left. She is a communications and public relations associate. Ketleho's in the middle. He is an engineer. And Jerry's on the right, and Jerry's an accountant. And so what we do is we take these kids and they do a 5-year partnership. So they go grades 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and they meet on a quarterly basis. So it's not a huge time commitment, but enough that there's accountability there. And they do things like go through workshops. They do things like writing. But they also have someone to just talk to, because a lot of times these kids' parents aren't educated. We do hands-on fieldwork to supplement textbook learning. So we took what our kids were learning in science class, and we took them and we got to blow some things up on a field, and that was a really cool experience for them. And they said, wow, ma'am, this makes a lot more sense now that I see it. And remember, in the village, they don't have opportunities. There's no science experiments. There's no biology lab in a classroom. We develop partnerships with schools to facilitate field trips to universities. So we don't believe that all children are going to go to a 4-year university. That's, I think, naive to think that. So we do technical schools. We do universities. We've taken them to a variety so they can see what that atmosphere is like. And it's almost magnetic once you realize your potential and you see it. And 4, we continually evaluate progress of learners. So we have meetings with teachers, their career mentors, parents, and students. So to really keep track of where we're going, hey, the career mentor might say to the parent, hey, your kid's really good at math. Let's work on this skill. And the parent might be like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Results. So before I get into results, I'll say I was once asked a question in an interview for a research job, and they said, so, did you get results on your last study? And I kind of laughed, because when you want to do social change, it doesn't happen overnight. It is something that you don't always see the results of immediately. But you take what you can get and you want to build something sustainable and continue evaluating. So that's kind of what we decided to do. So within the Rustenburg space, it's very difficult to cultivate relationships with different sectors since it's a rural area with limited opportunities. The real only industry is mining. So instead, we created a 5-year plan with Loneman, a mining company, to expose students to different careers. They're also provided with these mentors, experience, motivational speaking, school retention support, all of these things. And we have received really nice comments from students. This is the first time I've known what being a chemical engineer means. Thanks to talking with the accountant, I know it's important to keep working on my math skills. It makes math class more relevant, and I'll definitely pay more attention now, because a lot of kids don't understand why they're sitting in math class. Cat Laiho made me realize that I can be a lawyer since I love communicating opinions respectfully and always stand up for people who aren't being treated fairly. He told me I should keep reading the news so I can become more familiar with issues affecting everyday people. And then, now I don't have this in the PowerPoint, but I will talk about some struggles that we've briefly had with this project. Number one is, I've noticed this in the U.S., female students are still more likely to participate in school. They're the front row kids. They're the ones who take part in organizations like this. So one thing we've really done is amped up the number of male mentors we have, because there's still not enough male teachers. And getting more male teachers is a structural issue, so we can't, really change that now, but we can get more male mentors, and some of these boys are really connecting with male mentors and saying, wow, like Cat Laiho, he grew up in the village. He was the first person in his family to go to college. He did his bachelor's, he did his math and MBA, he's in mine management now. So I can do that because I see someone from my shoes who also did that, which has been really key, and it has kind of helped us overcome that problem with females being more likely to get involved. And the last thing I'd like to wrap up on is family. So a lot of our kids' families aren't educated, and so a lot of times we have families that are like, well, we don't know what our kids are doing with you, and that can be really frustrating on both ends. So what we did is we set up a parent meeting, and what the parents wanted to see was the actual economic benefit. So things like scholarships. Oh, my kid is more likely to get scholarships. My kid is more likely to get into college. They're likely to have increased income. And these are things that parents understand. I just tell you non-monetary benefits, and parents they're not always on the same page. So this is kind of what we've done, and it's just overall the general idea that really changing that face of poverty and breaking through that barrier starts young. But it does involve the entire community to do it. It involves mentors, it involves families. And when you do that, I think, and I hope, we'll really see some sustainable change in the future.
Thank you, Grace. Wow, such an interesting range of experience we have heard from our speakers, ranging from farmers to students to workers, practitioners, and a lot of good work already happening, but we know that is a long way still to go. We have heard from the sharing so far. Since each of the speakers has taken about 2 to 3 minutes more, so we have about 15 to 20 minutes left. I know you all would have a lot of questions, so please share your name and the place from where you are, and also share your question is addressed to which speaker. Yes, please.
My name is Victor. I'm from South Africa. So, Grace, Rustenburg is not rural. Rustenburg is not rural.
Your question is for any particular speaker?
Grace, your name is Grace.
Yeah, great.
Just a few corrections. Rustenburg, number one, is not rural. Number two, Grace, I'm not sure, right?
Yeah.
Look, you're partnering with non-mean, you spoke of Marikana, 8 people died. Marikana is dripping with blood, as I speak with you. These are the people who are directly implicated. And the dream for, what do you call it?
Dream on Africa.
Dream on Africa. Disaster in that you have not spoken to the fundamentals of where we are, where, in fact, learning for many, many years, the social problems you're talking about are created directly by learning. Very exploitative, extremely race-based, music-making, profit-making company. So learning with their headquarters overseas and milking South Africans as we speak. the children that spoke about, no laboratory, all of those things you talk about are as a direct result of what non-means continues to do and has been doing for ages. I mean, if you go to the Sake, I mean, the conditions there, only pigs can stay there. And this is after non-means. And Bafokeng implicated as well, greatly so. So I'm raising all of this to say that I think it would be remiss of me to stand here and say the dream for Africa would not do justice until and unless it deals with the fundamentals of why these problems are there. And surely and truly, you would not, maybe your project is flesh in the pan, more expedient, do this 2 years, 3 years, go away. But these problems you are relating to are deep, deep seated. As I speak here, you're going to continue for the next 50, 100 years to have all of this. I just want to make those things.
Can I respond to that?
So we'll take, because there will be more questions, maybe so we can answer them together. Yes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rekha Panigrahi from Care India, based in Bhubaneswar, Odisha, which is a state in India. So this is not a question or a comment, but my anxiety which I would like to share with Neha, and also would like to know, because you talked about, very important collective institutions of these informal workers, and we know that there are, a number of this kind of informal institutions in India. And they have been, talking about the issue mostly of the schemes, entitlements, this kind of, increasing the wage, but not taking, the discourse beyond that, or in their agenda, this engaging men and boys or gender justice, gender empowerment has not been in their agenda. So, and you have been doing some, very interesting study, and you are also coming out with some very interesting outcomes. So I'd like to know what is your next plan? How do we take up this kind of, findings and reflections with this kind of institutions to take forward, this course, because it's very important also to rope in these institutions, and they have a very important role to play.
Good morning. Sorry.
You go ahead.
Your turn. You didn't wait.
Thank you very much. I'd like really to thank and extend my appreciation for the 4 presenters. I have 2 questions. One goes to Emily and second one goes to Neha. I think your research really has come out quite a very interesting finding in terms of making change in terms of production and income to women. But I would like to hear more on what are there are areas where quite a lot of change has happened, and also areas where less change happened. In that regard, what does your research really tell us in terms of those factors which really contributed for making change in those areas where you have seen significant changes? The second question goes to Neha. I really like your theoretical framework, conceptual framework, where you use the bargaining approach. I think the bargaining approach is also very much affected by fallback positions. To what extent you already faced that fallback positions in this whole bargaining phase? That really matters, who gets what, and really to get into that bargaining, your fallback position really influences your average interest. Thank you.
Yeah, please do go ahead.
Good morning. This is Swaranjit from Punjab University, and at the outset I must congratulate all the presenters for having presented very structured papers, a good pieces of research, I must say. My query is directed to Emily, because I would just like you to elaborate a little more on the imposition of fine and penalty. Is it an institutional fine or penalty, or institutional, and then what kind of institutions are involved? Are these institutions only the governmental institutions, or it is being done even at the social level? And my second query is directed to Grace Pascal. I would like her to, contextualize her presentation to the main theme of this symposium. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Harita. I represent an organization called Human and Institutional Development Forum, India, Bangalore. One is a general reflection, not directed at anybody, but I was looking at the theme, recalibrating masculinities. When you open up this metaphor, recalibration, when you do calibration, you have a standard set of reference with which you, tune your instrument. So what's the reference that we are talking about? I mean, one thing that which was while listening to it is that is the standard reference that we are using is still outgoing, economically more powerful male image. So is it that more and more, is it economically gaining greater kind of access, is valued more than, let's say, men coming in and taking care of some of the reproductive tasks that we talk about. For example, that when I heard that in that Pune union work that Neha was talking about, what are the structures which are available for men to move in? If that is not celebrated enough, then the transformative work cannot go on. If the focus of the work has been bringing women out into the socio-economic, other opportunities, that's very critical. But not on kind of looking at men who move in. Are we underprivileging and undervaluing other aspects? So if a recalibration of masculinities need to happen, recalibration of femininity also need to happen, because we need to value it more. The other one is that the role of institutional spaces which are available and its role in bringing out change. It looked like a union which is progressive and also has a different gender sensitivity, has provided space for these women to move and assert themselves. When I look at what are the institutional spaces available for men, their families are socially conditioned in a stereotypical patriarchal way, and the workspaces are also same, then it raises a critical question that what are the institutional constructs that we are making available, creating, so that it can lead to a transformatory change, not just a kind of movement in who earns more money. Because if that is the case, this is fundamentally in contradiction with the overall sustainable, ecologically sensitive livelihoods we would like to build, pushing people as workers. I don't know where it will lead us. Thank you.
To this I would like to add one more. What about these hazardous sectors? How do we engage, men for gender equality in hazardous occupations like mining and all?
Okay, so we have just one or two more, and then we go for the second round, because then there are lots of questions. Yeah, please, ma'am, go ahead.
My name is Lata. I am from Pune, Maharashtra, and working with Center for Health and Social Justice. I congratulate all of our colleagues for a very good analytical presentation, but still I have some questions. One for Emily. While discussing about gender equality in agriculture, what were the discussions about land ownership of women? Because in South Asian countries, women are not given land ownership in many places, particularly in India, in South India, or maybe in the middle part of India. In tribal belt, there is land ownership to women in some area. I want to know about those discussions and reactions in the groups. My addition to Neha's presentation, Kagat Kas Patra Panchayat, the union, it's not just union for the sake of union, it has perspective, and perspective of gender equality and anti-caste movement. They are part and parcel of Maharashtra's anti-caste movement. And so the changes what occurred in women rag pickers, those are due to the perspective of the union. Union has fought workplace violence, and through that women are trained to fight against masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, even union opposed child marriages within the family. Women union opposed working child labor, and that's why the men in the family, they have to accept women's decision. So women's decision power is trained through the movement, through the group activities, and they are even the union participated in other struggles also. So the empowerment of rag pickers is the product of their union's perspective plus participation in wider movements. Then my question is to friend. In your analysis, workplace violence, because the masculinity and gender inequalities are expressed in workplace violence, particularly sexual harassment, and even the laws related and implementation of laws. So I want to know what is the status of such laws. Even my question is to Grace also, what they think about workplace violence, because these gender inequalities are expressed in workplace violence, sexual harassment, because in India also we find it in these neoliberal policies, a lot of increasing sexual violence on workplace we are getting. There is law, still it is not implemented by government authorities also. Thanks.
Okay, I think we will ask the speakers to answer, and then we go to the second round of questions, because we have just about 8 minutes left. So speak 1 minute or 2 minutes each, 1.5 minutes. You want to start because you have to high after.
All right. So going back to the first thing about loan min mines, so most corporations in South Africa have had race issues in the past. But our outlook is that if they're willing to try and make it right now, we're going to take advantage of that. And they're willing, and they have a lot of black people in management that want to reach out to us. And so we're going to take advantage of it. We're not going to harbor anger over what's already been done. If they want to fix it now, we will join hands with them to do that. Referring to Rustenburg, Rustenburg itself is not rural, but it's like calling it any big city. Like Delhi, there's also rural areas outside of it. So we call it Rustenburg, but it's really Pokang and some of the surrounding areas that we predominantly work with. And 3, to contextualize it, I would say engaging boys to improve socioeconomic outcomes through things like male mentors is really important to break past these traditional work structures that drive limited social mobility and ultimately that limit the middle class, because males are so important in really opening up those new opportunities, and getting them to venture into new fields and to see new opportunities is key to break past these rigid work structures. I don't have a lot to add to workplace violence because that's not really my area. Sorry.
I'm just going to actually quickly respond to what Grace said. When you said that when you're saying that the mining companies are trying to fix it, I think it's very, very dangerous to say that, because it's like, they're creating the problem, and this is the perfect way to get the public to see that they're actually doing something to fix it. And we see it all the time in India, where they have a mining company and then they'll open this school of social work. It's really dangerous. Yeah, that's just what I want to say. The second thing is responding to Rekha's question and actually what Latatai said. I think they're both very important. When the perspective of the union is very important, and today we see these huge organizations where membership becomes so crucial, and the whole emphasis on get more members, enroll them in insurance programs, increase wages, and yes, it is not enough. And I hope my research shows that it is not enough. And how to really take on these large organizations, I think I'm really early in my career. I would be a fool to do it, but I hope one day I can write a paper that really critiques the methodologies of coming together. I think it's very important to have a gender perspective. And yeah.
On the question around what are the factors that contribute, what accounts for the differences in where we've seen greater change and less change, and what factors contribute to that, I think what we've learned, or what we're able to illustrate, is that it's a progression. social transformation, and areas where men were more comfortable making changes are those that fall within sort of masculine domains. So helping with the farm work, or doing heavy lifting chores, or using tools and carts to fetch water to help with farm chores. And where there's less change is where it's more transformative, actually changing gender power or those traditional masculine practices, particularly the caregiving practices and that sort of thing. But what this methodology of outcome mapping helps us to do, and with the participation of the staff in the process, was to interpret that spectrum of change from what are the early changes that we can expect to see to what are those more progressive and transformative changes that we're hoping to get to in our vision for more gender equitable systems. So the involvement of the staff was really important in helping to interpret the changes that we were seeing, and also be where they wanted to get to. And on the question of land ownership, we have some pathways people who can talk about that a lot more afterwards. But we're working at the community level on advocacy with community leaders for communal access to land, for the groups to do their demonstration plots. We're talking in the gender dialogues about the intra-household allocation of land, so women often have to wait to get their parcel of land, and they often get a poor quality land. So we're talking about that allocation process, and we're also working at the institutional level in India, working directly with the government that's implementing the Forest Rights Act, and in Mali, raising more awareness about the Farm Bill, which has provisions for women in certain land allocation processes, and likewise in Tanzania. We have seen some greater awareness among men that women do have the right to land, and that it benefits them as a household. There is, women are getting access to collective land, that's a big change, but the quality of land, that's a slower change. And the access to more secure tenure, longer term agreements, that's something that we're working towards. That's not an early change, that's a longer term change.
So regarding the issue of workplace violence that you raised, it was not really directly the topic of my research either, but I think the fact that there was no awareness of the legal obligation to prevent unequal treatment, that's really indicative. And also some things that what they were saying on how they were framing gender and gender inequality and ways they were speaking about some groups can be, I think, interpreted as symbolic violence. It really depends on what kind of violence you mean. So I think that's an important topic definitely to discuss. But also I was going to just some ideas about what you asked about what is standard reference. I think that's a really important question, and of course it's clear that the ideal of hegemonic masculinity is really different in different local settings, and I think first it must be sort of analyzed empirically, maybe via media analysis, what is the local, what is the regional, what are the global ideals of hegemonic masculinity and how they relate. And in fact, as I mentioned, this transnational business masculinity, Raven Connell has been, promoting this or saying that this is the ideal, but in fact she has been criticized, and people have proposed that maybe we should think of hegemonic masculinities, like in multiple sort of masculinities and the ways how they're competing. I think that's something important to think about.
Okay, last maybe 2, maximum 3 questions we can take. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Drasko from Macedonia. My question goes to Kadri. Yeah. Did you detect any kind of promise in your interviews? Right, of aspects of, I wouldn't go that far to say transforming masculinity. But did you see some of those managers that are at least having a complicit position using R.W. Connell, positioning of different masculinities?
Let's take the questions. Other question? Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Lori Heisey from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Just one for Emily, which is just methodologically. So when you did the outcome mapping, did you do it only with staff, or did you have actual field work and interviews and focus groups and stuff that then the staff helped interpret? How did you sort of do that evaluation?
Okay. Okay, that's the last one. We have run out of time allocated to us, so that's the last question that we can take.
My name is Gopal, from South Africa. I'm really glad that you raised the question of privilege. I haven't had it yesterday. I didn't hear much of it about being privilege. But I think to you and to Grace, I haven't had quite a good understanding. It looks like we still think of power in a pre-Foucauldian way, right? Instead of saying power is everywhere, and we see how the dynamics of power in an institution's work. But the question to you is, I don't understand what you mean by intersectionality of privilege. Could you explain a little bit? Briefly, you missed out an opportunity to really do interesting work, because your work was not so much in masculinity, all genders, like you said. So Raywin, Japan, there's a whole lot of literature that you could have drawn in to help you work. Sometimes not doing work is better than doing work. What I see right there is you missed again some work that's been done in South Africa around struggles around mind. And I have a name for you, Malu Silani, I think doing some interesting work about competing masculinities and how that generally divided in mind. So the pity that you didn't tap into that work.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question, I think the ways in which these men articulated their position towards gender and gender equality actually constitute a way of doing masculinity in the Estonian context, and like showing complicity with that sort of prevalent ideal of hegemonic masculinity in the context of work. I think that was definitely I was describing a bit the ideal of hegemonic masculinity in Estonia, and I think that's their way of positioning themselves in relation to it. And if you're asking if there was any promise or there was any, I know that this sounds all very negative. I think I have to maybe to get deeper into my interview material to see that maybe there's something more subtle, but it really seemed that at least on the explicit level, they were quite really opposed. They were articulating in the ways that I was presenting. And about the intersectional privilege, that I think maybe it was a bit unclear. So I'm trying to summarize it shortly again what I meant by it. So if you take these categories that are relevant in a particular situation, in a context, like in my research, have gender, ethnicity, class. There are others, they were able-bodied as well. So if you take these categories and if you think where these men are positioned in the context of work, in the labor market, then they are sort of in the privileged ends or in privileged positions, so that they are at the same time privileged in terms of all these categories. That's what I meant. Not that they would be disadvantaged in some other context. As I was saying, the example of them moving out of Estonia, going to, let's say, Western Europe, then they become less privileged in terms of ethnicity, let's say. But I meant it's all the intersectional privilege means that they are in this context privileged in terms of all the categories simultaneously.
Okay, thank you.
On the methodological question, we involved the staff as data collectors as part of our research team and involved them in the analysis. So they were conducting some of the interviews, and then we did it every other day process where as a group we analyzed and we mapped out the behavior changes. We pulled out the behavior changes that we'd observed, categorized them, and tried to fit them into the progression from expects to love to see changes.
Anybody else? No, we had a question.
Do we have time for
one quick question? No, you can do it later, yeah. So thank you everybody, and I would also like to thank our speakers today. Friends, just to sum up, I think as we all know, and we have also heard from these experiences, that gender socialized roles do tend to place more resources in the hands of men. We know that. And at least in this session, we are happy to see that in this whole overall symposium, a lot of men have been participating. So it is really heartening to see that men are actually coming forward. And while these resources tend to be concentrated in the hands of men, women continue with their caregiving and nutritional responsibilities at the home front, which limits their participation in the workforce that this session was focusing on. And I think it is this kind of experiences, this kind of research and work which should come together, and we should learn from each other to globalize this kind of struggle, because we have been working, all of us have been working in our own smaller ways, and in a globalized world we need to globalize this kind of struggles, and more men should come forward, and we would look forward to working with you all to globalize this struggle and make a more just and equal society. And that is where I think we were talking of recalibrating. We're talking of a just and equal society. So the imbalances which exist, how we can make it in a more balanced way, I think. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, quick question. I wanted to know, for the men who did change, there were a lot of changes, what was in it for them? Like, why did they want to change?
May I have your panel, please?
Deeper.